It was 2:17 p.m. when I walked out of that cafe, and the sky was so bright it felt insulting. The kind of clear afternoon that makes everything look normal even when it isn't. I didn't feel shaky or furious, and I didn't feel the urge to do anything reckless. I felt something colder than anger. I felt certain. Adrian thought he'd held his ground in there. He believed the conversation ended in a draw, that he'd sat across from me and survived it. What he didn't understand was that the moment he agreed to sit down, he stepped into my frame, and he didn't leave with it. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I parked 2 streets over from Melissa's gallery and watched the entrance like I was waiting for a delivery window. I didn't need confirmation that she'd been seeing him. I wanted timing, rhythm, the kind of detail that tells you where a person's head really is. At 3:04 p.m., she walked out, and she looked lighter than she had that morning, relaxed, almost glowing. Adrian followed a few steps behind her like he belonged there, like he had a claim to the air around her. He opened her car door and she smiled. Not politely, not out of habit, but the way you smile when something makes you feel chosen. Then he touched her lower back as she stepped into the seat, and it wasn't subtle, it wasn't accidental, it was ownership. In that moment, I realized he had taken our cafe meeting as a test of dominance, and he believed he had passed. He was wrong, but the danger wasn't that he was wrong. The danger was that he was confident. That evening, I didn't bring the cafe up again. I let the house stay quiet because silence creates space, and space makes people talk. She filled it around 9:12 p.m. when she asked, "Did he threaten you?" And I said, "No." She asked, "Did you threaten him?" And I said, "No." She looked frustrated, like my calm was an insult, and she pressed, "Then what did you say?" I told her, "The truth." Her arms folded. "Which is?" I answered, "That unstable attachments collapse." Her eyes narrowed and she said, "You keep calling him unstable." And I told her, "He is." She shook her head. "You don't even know him." I said, "I know his pattern." And she snapped, "You don't get to reduce people to patterns, Daniel." I held her gaze and said, "I do when they park outside my house." That was the first time her breathing changed for real. She tried to dismiss it, tried to tell herself I was exaggerating, but the panic flickered across her face when she asked, "He didn't." And I said, "He did." She went still, then asked, "When?" And I told her, "3 nights ago. And tonight, probably." She stared at me like she'd just realized she'd invited something into our life that didn't know how to leave. At 10:48 p.m., headlights slowed outside and she saw them too. Her body froze before her mind could catch up. She walked to the window trying to make it innocent, trying to make it coincidence, and the car didn't park. It rolled slowly, then accelerated away. She said too quickly, "He's just driving." And I answered, "Yes, he is." She didn't sleep well that night. I did. Not because I didn't care, but because certainty is quieter than fear. The next morning, I requested 3 days off work. My supervisor didn't ask for much, just looked at me and said, "Everything okay?" And I told him, "Not exactly." He nodded once and said, "Take the time you need." That was why I respected him. He didn't pry. He trusted. On day one, I visited an attorney. Not because I was filing, because I was preparing. I didn't go to someone flashy, someone who advertised toughness. I went to someone quiet, a man who looked like he'd spent his life watching people try to destroy each other in court and learning how to stop it from happening. His name was Marcus Ellison, 48 years old, no social media, known for strategic settlements. When I told him everything, the cafe, the car outside the house, the shift in her behavior, the way Adrian had started orbiting our life, he listened without interruption and then asked the simplest question, "Do you want to divorce her?" I said, "Not yet." He studied me for a moment and asked, "Then what do you want?" I said, "Containment." He nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. "That's more complicated than divorce," he said, and I told him, "I know." He asked if I had proof of the affair. I told him, "Not physical proof, digital patterns, vehicle movement, suspicious financial shifts." That last part changed his expression. "Financial shifts?" he repeated, and I told him I'd reviewed our accounts the night before. Melissa had been moving small amounts into a separate account. Nothing dramatic, but consistent. A slow leak, not a splash. How much? Marcus asked. Over 6 months, I said. Roughly 80,000. He leaned back and said, that's not emotional. That's structural. I nodded. Exactly. He asked, what's your endgame? I told him, if she's planning an exit strategy, I want to control the timing. And if he's escalating, I want him documented. Marcus nodded and said he could put a private investigator on him. Discreet, no confrontation, no drama, just evidence. I said, do it. The investigator's name was Caleb. Former police, now independent. He didn't speak much, just took notes, asked a few clean questions, and then said, you think he's dangerous? I told him, not yet, but he will be if rejected. Caleb nodded once and said, men like that don't like being replaced. I said, no, they don't. That evening, Melissa tried to make the house feel normal again. She cooked, which surprised me. Pasta, garlic bread, a bottle of wine. She poured herself a glass and said, you don't drink. And I said, no. Her hands were slightly unsteady as she lifted the glass. After a while, she said, you're overreacting about him. I asked, am I? She insisted, yes. He's not obsessed. He's intense. That's different. I told her, no, it's not. She sighed, frustrated, and said, you think I'm stupid? I answered, no. I think you're underestimating him. Then I added, and yourself. That confused her. What does that mean? She asked. I said, you think you can walk away when this gets uncomfortable. The silence that followed told me she'd already considered it. The next morning, she told him they needed space. Caleb followed her and reported back without drama, just facts. He didn't take it well, he said. Raised voice, pacing, hands on his head. I asked, then what? Caleb said, then he followed her car, all the way home. I nodded because that was exactly what I'd expected. That wasn't romance. That was control. That night at 8:33 p.m., there was a knock on our door. Not polite, not hesitant, sharp and repeated. Before I even stood, Melissa went pale. She already knew. I opened the door and there he was, Adrian, eyes bloodshot, breathing uneven, posture tight with entitlement. We need to talk, he said. I answered, no. He tried to step forward and I blocked him without raising my voice. He stared at me like he couldn't believe I would physically deny him access. You don't get to decide that, he said. I told him, actually, I do. Melissa appeared behind me and said, Adrian, go home. He didn't look at me then. He looked past me at her, like I was furniture. You can't just cut me off like this, he said. She swallowed and said, I told you this was complicated. He laughed sharply. Complicated, he said. You said you were unhappy. She said quietly, I am. Then he leaned into it. Then leave him. The air went heavy. She didn't answer. And that was the fracture point. His face changed, like a switch flipped from desire to humiliation. You're choosing him, he asked, and she said, I'm choosing stability. That word hit him hard. He looked at her like stability was an insult. Then he looked at me. I said, leave, or I call the police. He held my gaze for a moment, like he wanted to test whether I would bluff. I didn't blink. He stepped back. But he didn't look defeated. He looked humiliated. And humiliation is more dangerous than anger. He left, but not cleanly. Later that night, at 11:14 p.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. A photo. Melissa walking into his loft months earlier. Time-stamped. A message followed. You think you're in control? I didn't respond. Caleb traced the number within the hour. Burner, predictable. The message wasn't for me, not really. It was for his ego. It was his way of refusing the boundary. And boundaries are where unstable men either disappear or decide to go to war. By then, Melissa was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone like it was a weapon she didn't know how to disarm. She whispered, "This is getting out of hand." And I said, "It already did." She asked, "What are you going to do?" And I answered, "What I should have done earlier." She looked at me like she didn't recognize me. That was the point, because she had spent months believing my silence meant ignorance. Now she was learning what it really meant. It meant preparation. And the worst part for her was this. It wasn't just that I knew about the affair. It was that I knew what came next. The next morning, the house felt different. Not louder, not tense in the obvious way couples fight. It felt hollow, like something structural had shifted inside the walls. Melissa didn't leave for work immediately. She moved slower than usual, watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. I could feel her recalculating, trying to determine how much control she still had over the situation. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been in weeks. "He sent you something, didn't he?" she asked. I didn't lie. "Yes," she swallowed. "What?" I met her eyes. "Proof." She went pale, and for the first time since this started, I saw fear that wasn't about losing me. It was about losing narrative. She asked to see it. I told her no. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because control over information is leverage. "Daniel, please," she said, and I shook my head slowly. "You already know what it shows." She looked away first. That told me everything. Shame had entered the room. Not enough to stop her months ago, but enough now that consequences were visible. Around noon, Caleb called. His tone hadn't changed. It never did. "He's spiraling," he said. "Explain." Caleb told me Adrian hadn't gone home after leaving our house the night before. He drove around for nearly 2 hours, parked outside the gallery, parked near our neighborhood, then ended up at a bar alone. 2 drinks, phone in hand the entire time, messaging repeatedly. "To her?" I asked. "Yes, and someone else." That made me pause. "Who?" Caleb said he was still digging. When I hung up, I understood something clearly. Adrian wasn't just losing access to Melissa. He was losing the story he had built about himself. In his mind, he wasn't the other man. He was the better man. And when that illusion cracks, unstable people look for someone to blame. That evening, Melissa confronted me in the kitchen. "Are you having me followed?" she asked. I didn't deny it. "Yes." Her face shifted from fear to anger. "That's insane." "No," I replied evenly. "That's precaution." She paced. "You can't just surveil people like this." I looked at her calmly. "You brought him into our life." That silenced her for a moment, but only briefly. "This is between you and me," she insisted. "It stopped being between us when he showed up at our door." She had no answer for that. Later that night, another message came through from an unknown number. This time it wasn't a photo. It was a voice recording, 32 seconds long. I played it once. Adrian's voice, controlled but strained. "You think you're superior because you don't react. That's not strength. That's fear." I deleted it immediately after Caleb archived it. The content didn't matter. The escalation did. The following afternoon, something shifted again. Melissa didn't come home at her usual time. She texted that she needed to clear her head. I didn't respond. Caleb called within 40 minutes. "She met him," he said. My jaw tightened, but my voice stayed level. "Where?" "Public park. They argued." "Physical?" "No, but loud." I asked him to send the footage. I didn't watch it immediately. I waited until she was home. She walked in just after sunset. Her eyes were red. She had been crying. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood in the living room like someone who didn't recognize their own house. Finally, she spoke. "He says you're manipulating this." I almost smiled. "Of course he does." She shook her head. "He says you're trying to isolate me." I stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough to narrow the distance. "Melissa, you're not isolated. You're confronted." That hit her harder than yelling would have. She sat down and covered her face. "I didn't think it would go this far." I answered quietly. "It always does." There was a long pause before she asked the question she'd been avoiding. "If I end it with him, completely, can we fix this?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple. "Ending it doesn't erase it," I said finally, "but it stops the bleeding." She nodded slowly. "I'll end it." I watched her carefully. "Not in person," I added. "Not alone." She hesitated. That hesitation told me she still underestimated him. "He deserves closure," she said weakly. "No," I corrected. "He deserves distance." The next morning, she sent the message ending it. Caleb confirmed Adrian read it within seconds. Then came the call. She didn't answer. Then another, and another. Then a voicemail. Caleb transcribed it. It wasn't romantic anymore. It wasn't poetic. It was angry, accusatory. You used me. You're choosing comfort over passion. He's controlling you. The words weren't important. The tone was. 2 nights later, someone slashed one of our car tires. No note, no witness, just damage. I didn't accuse him out loud. I didn't need to. Caleb had already documented Adrian driving past twice that evening. Melissa's fear was real now. Not theatrical, not manipulative. Real. She looked at me differently. Not as the steady background presence she'd grown bored of, but as the only predictable variable in chaos. Marcus filed preliminary protective documentation the next day. Not a full restraining order yet, just groundwork, quiet legal pressure. Adrian received notice that further contact could be interpreted as harassment. That changed his strategy. The messages stopped, the drive-bys stopped, but something else started. Online posts, vague ones at first, quotes about betrayal, about false love, about men who pretend to be honorable while hiding behind control. Then less vague, references to suburbia, to fake marriages, to women trapped in cages. It was transparent but dangerous in a different way. He wasn't trying to win her back anymore. He was trying to salvage pride publicly. Melissa saw them. So did people from the gallery. Whispers began. Her professional world started to feel unstable. And that's when she finally understood the full cost of what she had started. One night, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, she said quietly, "I think I ruined everything." I looked at her for a long time before answering. "You destabilized it." She nodded. "Are you going to leave me?" I didn't soften it. "That depends on what happens next." She cried then. Not dramatically, not performatively, quietly. The kind of crying that comes when denial finally runs out of space. And for the first time since this began, Adrian wasn't the center of the room anymore. The real confrontation was between us. But the difference now was this. I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was deciding what to do with it. And Adrian, somewhere out there, was realizing something much worse than rejection. He was realizing he had picked the wrong man to compete with. The confession didn't explode out of her. It didn't come in a dramatic breakdown or a desperate attempt to stop me from walking away. It surfaced slowly, like something she had been holding underwater for years and no longer had the strength to keep submerged. The house was quiet that night, not tense in the obvious way couples argue, but heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. She had been pacing most of the evening, not checking her phone anymore, not looking toward the windows, just moving from room to room as if she were rehearsing something in her head. When she finally stopped in the doorway, between the kitchen and the living room, and said my name, her voice didn't carry accusation or defense. It carried exhaustion. "Daniel." I looked up from the table. She hesitated before walking toward me, her movements slower than usual, deliberate. She sat down across from me and folded her hands together, as though she were bracing for impact. "There's something I didn't tell you." I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod. I didn't encourage her. I just waited. People reveal more when silence isn't competing with them. "It didn't start with Adrian," she said. "I already knew that much. Affairs don't begin in a vacuum. They attach themselves to fractures that already exist." "It started years ago," she continued, her eyes fixed on the grain of the table instead of my face. That part I hadn't known. I felt something tighten behind my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral. "Go on." She swallowed before speaking again. "I've felt invisible for a long time. Not unloved, not abused, not neglected. Invisible. You're steady, Daniel. You've always been steady." The words weren't insulting, but they weren't praise either. But steady doesn't feel like passion. It feels like maintenance. Maintenance. The word landed between us like a verdict. "When did that start?" I asked quietly. "After the second miscarriage." The room went completely still. We had tried for a third child 7 years ago. Twice. Both pregnancies ended early. Both quietly. There had been no screaming, no throwing blame across the room, no dramatic implosion. We absorbed it and moved forward, or at least I thought we did. "You never broke," she said. "You just adjusted. You went back to work 2 days later. You didn't cry in front of me. You didn't rage. You didn't fall apart. I thought that was strength. She finally lifted her eyes to meet mine. It felt like distance. That hurt more than if she had accused me outright, because she wasn't entirely wrong. I had compartmentalized it. I had treated it like a structural failure that required reinforcement, not emotional collapse. I thought holding everything together was the responsible thing to do. I thought if one of us broke down completely, the house would break with us. I thought I was protecting you, I said. I know, she replied softly, but I didn't need protecting. I needed someone to fall apart with me. The silence after that was heavier than anything we had endured during the weeks of Adrian's escalation. This wasn't about sex. This wasn't about flirtation or ego or boredom. This was about grief that had never been spoken properly. I started feeling like you didn't need me emotionally, she continued, like you could survive anything without me. And if someone doesn't need you, you stop chasing them. That sentence lingered. When Adrian came along, she said it wasn't just the attention, it was the reaction. He felt things loudly. He got angry when I talked about losing the pregnancies. He said you were emotionally frozen. I didn't defend you. I didn't defend myself. I just listened. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't defend myself either. Then she said something that changed the axis of the conversation. It wasn't my first time crossing a line. My body didn't react outwardly, but something inside me shifted sharply. Explain. 3 years ago, she said quietly, the real estate conference in Brisbane. I remembered that conference. She had come home tired but composed, said it was long, said the networking was exhausting. Just once, she rushed to add. It didn't continue, it wasn't emotional. It was one night. I told myself it didn't count because it didn't mean anything. I told myself it was grief, or loneliness, or weakness. I told myself whatever I needed to so I could still look at you every day. You've been carrying that for 3 years, I asked. Yes. Why tell me now? Because if you're going to leave me, I don't want you leaving for the wrong reason. That was layered. The wrong reason. You think Adrian is the wrong reason? He's a symptom, she said, not the disease. The air between us felt thinner. I needed to know if you ever noticed I was slipping away, she continued. Did you ever see me disappearing? I had noticed changes. I had noticed deviations in behavior, tone, pattern, but I had categorized them. I hadn't confronted them emotionally. I saw changes, I admitted, but I treated them like variables. She gave a small, almost broken laugh. Exactly. There it was. The difference between us. She wanted emotional collision. I built containment. Somewhere between those two instincts, a gap formed. Adrian hadn't created the gap. He stepped into it. I don't know if I cheated because I was unhappy, she said slowly, or if I became unhappy because I cheated. That honesty cut deeper than any denial could have. For the first time since this started, Adrian wasn't the center of the conversation. The question wasn't whether he would escalate again. The question was whether what we had left was habit or something real. I stood slowly, not out of anger, but because sitting felt suffocating. I need time, I said. She nodded. I know. I walked out of the room without slamming doors, without raising my voice, without theatrics. But something fundamental had shifted. Betrayal born of boredom is one thing. Betrayal layered over years of unspoken grief is something else entirely. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't thinking about Adrian's instability. I was thinking about whether my steadiness had been strength or avoidance, and whether her hunger for intensity had been loneliness or self-destruction. Part 3 would not be about confrontation. It would be about decision. I didn't sleep in our bed that night. It wasn't anger that kept me away. It was clarity. I couldn't lie beside her and pretend the ground beneath us wasn't fractured. I took a blanket to the living room and stretched out on the couch, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly in the dark. Each rotation felt deliberate, mechanical, steady, the way I had always been. Upstairs, I could hear her moving occasionally. Not crying, not pacing, just awake. The house didn't feel broken, it felt suspended, like something waiting for a verdict. Sometime after 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed once against the coffee table. The sound cut through the silence sharply. Unknown number. I didn't need to guess. I let it sit there for nearly a full minute before picking it up. One message, one sentence. You don't know the whole truth. No punctuation, no elaboration, just bait. Adrian. I read it once, then locked the screen without replying. Men like him escalate when you engage. They unravel when you don't. Upstairs, I heard soft footsteps. A moment later, Melissa appeared at the edge of the hallway, her silhouette faint in the low light. She looked smaller somehow, less composed than she had even hours earlier. Was that him? She asked quietly. Yes. She stepped into the room but didn't come too close. What did he say? He thinks I don't know the whole truth. Her breathing changed almost imperceptibly, and that was when I saw it. Not fear, not anger, not even guilt. Recognition. A flicker of something unfinished, something unresolved. What truth? I asked, calm enough that it almost sounded detached. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lowered herself into the armchair across from me and folded her hands together the way she had earlier at the table. There are things you don't know, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I held her gaze. Then tell me. She looked at me for a long time, long enough that the silence stopped feeling accidental. It felt chosen, deliberate. I can't, she said. That was the moment something colder than anger settled in. Not because of what she admitted, but because of what she refused to. I stood slowly, not to intimidate her, not to dominate the room, just to create distance between us. Then we're not done, I said. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't chase me up the stairs. She just sat there watching me as if she knew this wasn't the end of a fight, but the beginning of something deeper. And for the first time since this began, I realized something unsettling. Adrian wasn't the only one escalating. She had been holding something back. Something older than him. Older than the conference in Brisbane. Older, maybe, than the miscarriages. As I walked into the guest room and closed the door behind me, one thought settled into place with absolute clarity. I had prepared for obsession. I had prepared for instability. I had prepared for legal maneuvering and reputational damage and emotional fallout. What I hadn't prepared for was the possibility that my wife had been living an entirely different internal life long before Adrian ever appeared. And if that was true, then this wasn't containment anymore. It was excavation. If you've stayed with this story until the end, then you understand something important. This was never just about an affair. It wasn't about Adrian. It wasn't even about betrayal in the simple sense. It was about silence, about grief that was never spoken, about distance that grows quietly while two people convince themselves everything is stable. Sometimes love doesn't explode, it erodes. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in a marriage isn't anger, it's invisibility. Daniel built steadiness, Melissa chased intensity, and somewhere between control and craving, something fragile cracked. Not every story ends with revenge. Not every story ends with reconciliation. Some stories end with truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is cleaner than illusion. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, take a moment to like the video. It helps more than you know. And if you want more slow-burn relationship dramas like this, stories about betrayal, awakening, and the lives that begin after everything falls apart, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is House of Second Lives, because when one life fractures, another one begins.